when Theodore Roosevelt was elected, in fact, the ticket won in 1900, he was elected vice president. He became so bored with his job that he seriously toyed with the idea of going to law school while he was vice president. He had attended law school very briefly out of college, but he dropped out to do something else. And now that he was vice president, time was hanging heavy on his hands. And he thought, well, I'll at least complete my law degree and get something out of my time as vice president before he had a chance to re-enroll at Columbia Law School. William McKinley was assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt became president. Well, about this time, the true cost of the war in Cuba and in the Philippines was becoming known. The war between the United States and Spain had ended a mere 4 months after it began. And it was described, somewhat ironically, as a splendid little war by John Hay, one of Roosevelt's friends. And it seemed so at the time. The United States had won, Cuba gained its independence, and Spain was ejected from the Western Hemisphere and from the Philippines. And so, from that narrow standpoint, it seemed like a great idea. But things got more complicated because at the end of the war, the United States annexed the Philippines. The United States made sure that Cuba got its independence, but not the Filipinos. Now, the Filipinos, unbeknownst to most Americans, had already started a revolution of their own for their own independence against Spain. The United States came in and squashed that revolution, and the Filipinos became independent of Spain, but not of the United States. And so very shortly, a revolution against the United States broke out. And this is where it starts to sound eerily familiar. American troops were not greeted as liberators by the Filipinos, but as occupiers, as oppressors. And an insurgency broke out against American forces in the Philippines. And American forces began resorting to harsh tactics against the insurgents, including a form of harsh interrogation that was then called waterboarding. No, excuse me, I'm confused. It wasn't called waterboarding, it was called the water cure, but it was essentially the same thing. It was, the delicate term these days is simulated drowning. What you basically do is pour water down a person's throat and into the lungs and everything else, and so the person really does feel like he is drowning. And then you stop the process when they tell you what you want to hear. And this aspect, if there's no other name for it but torture, and this aspect of torture became very controversial in the United States. Congress held hearings, and there were reprimands, commanders in the field were relieved, and Americans became very disillusioned about this undertaking that they had been led into by Theodore Roosevelt. And very quickly they turned against the war that they had supported so enthusiastically just a short while before. And people like Theodore Roosevelt, who had thought that he had the United States behind him as he helped push the United States into war, was forced to acknowledge that this war had been a bad idea. As he explained, the United States controlled the Philippines, sort of, but in fact the Philippines became what Roosevelt called America's Achilles heel, its weak spot in its security perimeter. And in fact, it remained America's weak spot for the next 40 years until December 7th, 1941. Because it was the American position in the Philippines that prompted the Japanese attack on the United States at Pearl Harbor. The American position in the Philippines allowed the United States to prevent Japan from spreading south. And this was what provoked the Japanese to attack the United States. Okay, that's the first president and the first war. And the lesson there is you can lead Americans to war, but it's hard to keep them at war when things go badly. Why is this? Because support for war is fundamentally a matter of domestic politics. America's wars are only partly about How do the soldiers perform in those foreign theaters? Mostly they're about how long will the American people support this particular war, whatever that war happens to be.